Every time those eyes turn black, the fandom cheers. Aqua goes cold and calculating in a negotiation, Ruby's pupils fracture into two small stars, and the comment sections light up the same way they would for a power-up in any other anime. Main character mode, activated. Nobody claps like that at a funeral, which is strange because that's closer to what's actually happening on screen. Think about how the visual actually reads, frame by frame, before any interpretation gets layered on top of it. A power-up in most anime adds something, a glow, an aura, a new color that signals capability arriving from somewhere. What happens to these eyes is closer to the opposite. Color leaves. The warm brown that made a character look like an actual person goes flat and dark, replaced by two small symmetrical points of light that read, if you strip away the genre expectations, less like strength surfacing and more like something being switched off. The animation itself is quietly telling you this is a subtraction, not an addition. And the fandom has spent years cheering the subtraction as if it were the opposite. The black stars were never a badge of strength. Watch what a character is doing in the exact scene where they first appear, and a different pattern shows up every time. It isn't power arriving, it's a person leaving. The eyes don't turn dark because someone's gotten stronger. They turn dark because someone, in that specific moment, has stopped being who they were and started performing someone else's script instead. And the show has been marking that exact transaction, character after character, since the very first episode, without once explaining it out loud. Start with Ruby because her turn is the clearest, the one with the least room for another explanation once you actually watch it happen. She's in Takachiho. She finds Goro's bones. That's the confirmation of the one loss she spent her whole second life refusing to fully process. The death of the man who raised her in her first life, the death her entire reincarnation has been quietly orbiting without her ever saying so directly. And in the scene immediately following that discovery, something changes in how she carries herself that has nothing to do with grief the way grief usually gets drawn. No collapse, no numbness. She gets sharper, more charming, more willing to manufacture a lie and wheel time to move a scandal network exactly where she needs it to go, and the two black stars appear right there, stitched into the same beat as the loss itself. That timing is the whole argument in miniature. Grief doesn't usually produce competence like that, not immediately, not as its very first output. Grief produces the opposite, disorganization, a person needing time before they can function at their previous level, let alone above it. What appears in Ruby instead is instant fluency in exactly the register her mother used to run the entertainment industry. The charm deployed as a weapon, the warmth calibrated to extract rather than to connect, the entire toolkit I built to survive her own trauma, suddenly available to her daughter at the precise moment her daughter's trauma reactivates. Ruby isn't coping with Goro's death. She's outsourcing the coping to a persona that was never actually hers, one she inherited the way you'd inherit a role you never auditioned for. The girl doing the negotiating in that scene isn't fully Ruby anymore. She's running I's old operating system, because her own system just took a hit it wasn't built to survive, and something needed to be online immediately. Notice, too, what doesn't happen in the scenes that follow, because the absence carries as much weight as the presence of the black stars themselves. Ruby doesn't go back to being the version of herself who existed before Takachiho once the immediate crisis passes. There's no scene where she sits with the loss properly, processes it the slow way a person actually has to, and then returns to her normal register having done that work. The competent, manipulative version of her just keeps running, scene after scene, because once the borrowed self takes over the machinery of a negotiation, there's no built-in mechanism for handing control back. The show never stages a moment where Ruby consciously decides to keep operating this way. It just quietly stops cutting back to the version of her that existed before the bones were found, and most viewers don't notice the switch was permanent until several episodes later when they realize they can't remember the last time she sounded like herself. That would already be enough to make the case if it were the only piece of evidence in play. It isn't the strongest piece, and it isn't even the piece that should convince you first. The piece that should convince you is the one that runs backward. The moment where losing the black star, not gaining it, turns out to be the healthiest thing that happens to a character in the entire series. Aqua spends most of his second life believing his father is the man responsible for what happened to Ai. That belief is the engine behind almost everything he does. The infiltration of Strawberry Productions, the years of manufactured intimacy with people he's using as instruments in a longer plan, the entire architecture of a revenge he's built his whole personality around executing. Then, for a stretch of the story, he believes that belief has already paid off. He thinks his father is dead, killed by circumstances that for a moment look like they've closed the case without Aqua even needing to finish pulling the trigger himself. And in that stretch, brief, almost accidental, clearly not meant to last, his black star disappears. He starts living something that looks, for the first time since he was reincarnated, like an actual life instead of a mission with a body attached to it. He spends real time with Kana. He spends real time with Akane. Not managing them as assets in the plan, not extracting anything useful from the interaction, just existing alongside people who like him, in scenes that have no strategic payoff attached to them at all. It's the only extended window in the entire story where Aqua reads as something closer to a teenager than an operative, and it happens exactly when he believes the revenge no longer requires him. Watch what those scenes actually look like on screen, because the show draws them with a completely different visual language than almost anything else in Aqua's story. He laughs in a way that isn't calculated to produce an effect on someone else. He gets teased and reacts like it lands, instead of processing the tease as information to be filed. There's an ease to his posture around Kana and Akane in this stretch that simply doesn't exist anywhere else in his second life. Not with his fellow idols he's using as cover, not with the industry figures he's cultivating as future leverage, not even with Ruby, whose closeness to him is still, underneath the sibling warmth, tangled in the plan he's running. For the length of this one window, Aqua isn't running anything. He's just there. That's the detail that should stop you, because it flips the whole assumption the fandom's been running on its head. If the black stars were a power-up, losing one should read as a loss, weaker, less capable, back to baseline. It doesn't read that way here. It reads as relief, as a boy getting to put something down that had been crushing him the entire time he was carrying it, even though he'd built his entire identity around insisting he needed to keep carrying it. The eyes aren't tracking strength going up or down. They're tracking how much of the actual person is still present versus how much has been replaced by the role required to finish the mission. And the moment the mission looks finished, even falsely, the person underneath gets to surface again for exactly as long as the false belief holds. It doesn't hold. His father isn't dead. the belief collapses and the black star comes back because the mission isn't actually over and the performance has to resume. That return should be the saddest reveal in the entire arc, and it barely gets treated as one, because by that point, the audience has already been trained to read the black stars as a cool thing happening to a competent character, instead of a warning sign attached to a boy losing access to his own life a second time. Here's the read that should complicate all of this before it goes any further, because it's not a weak objection and it deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. The entertainment industry, as this show draws it, doesn't reward honesty. It rewards performance, charisma, the ability to construct exactly the persona a given room needs and deliver it convincingly on command. Ai herself says as much repeatedly across her own arc. The lie is the job. Survival in that world might genuinely require exactly the tool the black stars represent, the capacity to build a mask precise enough to fool an industry built entirely on masks. Reading that capacity as pure self-destruction risks missing what the story is also clearly showing. These characters use the black stars to actually accomplish things. Ruby manipulates the Scandal network successfully. Aqua infiltrates Strawberry Productions successfully. If the tool works, calling it a curse might just be romanticizing failure to survive in a rigged system that never gave these characters an honest option in the first place. Push that argument as far as it can reasonably go, because the show gives you plenty of material to push it with. Nearly every adult in this industry who succeeds is running some version of the same performance. Agents softening bad news into something a client can hear. Producers manufacturing a narrative around a scandal before the tabloids can write their own. Idols rehearsing a version of gratitude and humility that has to look identical whether they're feeling it that day or not. None of that gets treated as a curse in the story. It gets treated as the baseline cost of the job, unremarkable, the water everyone in this world is swimming in. If competent performance is simply what surviving this industry requires, singling out the black stars as uniquely damning starts to look less like an observation about these specific characters and more like an objection to the entire premise of show business. That argument holds for exactly as long as you only look at what the black stars accomplish and refuse to look at what they cost the person using them, which is precisely the substitution the show keeps forcing you to make and then quietly correcting. Survival in the industry at the price of your own selfhood isn't a workaround the story is endorsing. It's the specific trap Akasaka keeps building the entire narrative around. And the evidence for that isn't abstract. It's sitting in the fate of every character who ends up living inside the Black Star full time, instead of visiting it under duress. Ai has it more or less permanently by the time the story catches up to her, and Ai is dead within the first arc, killed by the exact fracture between her real self and her performed one, finally becoming impossible to hold together. Kamiki has it, arguably more completely than anyone else in the cast, and Kamiki is a serial killer. Someone who's replaced whatever human structure used to organize his empathy with something that processes other people purely as material. The same operating logic Ruby borrows for a scene and Aqua wears for years, just run all the way out to its furthest, least survivable conclusion. And Aqua himself, the character the story spends the most time inside, becomes something closer to a hollow shell the longer he stays in the Black Star full time. Competent, effective, terrifying when he needs to be, and increasingly unreachable to the people who are trying to actually reach him. None of those are success stories. If the black stars were simply the necessary cost of survival, you'd expect at least one character to wear one permanently and come out the other side intact. Nobody does. The tool works exactly as advertised, every time, at exactly the cost the show keeps insisting it will extract. Which means the counter-argument isn't wrong about what the black stars can accomplish. It's wrong about what accomplishing it is worth. There's a difference worth drawing out between what those other adults in the industry are doing and what the black stars specifically mark, because the difference is what makes the symbol meaningful instead of just a stylistic flourish. An agent softening bad news is still operating from something like their own judgment, their own read of the room, adjusted for the audience, but still recognizably theirs. What the black stars mark isn't adjustment, it's substitution, an entire self getting swapped out for a different one, wholesale, built specifically because the original couldn't survive what it was being asked to carry. Kamiki isn't a man who's learned to perform charm over genuine ruthlessness the way a hardened producer might. He's a man for whom the performance appears to be the only thing left running. That's the line the show is drawing, carefully, across 4 different characters, and it's a much narrower claim than acting professional is corrosive. It's closer to there's a point past which the performance stops sitting on top of a person and starts being the only thing still there. Kamiki's case is the one the show gives the least sympathy to, and that's deliberate, because he's the clearest picture of where the trajectory ends if nothing interrupts it. Whatever original self existed underneath his own performance isn't glimpsed anywhere in the story the way Ai's occasionally surfaces, or the way Aqua's briefly resurfaces with Kana and Akane. There's no scene of him laughing at something without calculating the effect of the laugh, no unguarded moment the narrative offers as evidence that a person is still in there, buried but present. He's simply the black star operating with nothing left to check it, competence without a self attached to direct it toward anything but harm. He isn't a cautionary exception to the pattern the other 3 demonstrate. He's what the pattern looks like once it's had the most time and the fewest interruptions to run its course. This is where the specific psychology underneath the metaphor actually earns its place, instead of just being a label stapled onto the ending. There's a concept for exactly this. A person faced with trauma too large to survive as themselves builds a second self specifically engineered to handle the world the original self couldn't. Competent, charming, able to say the right thing in any room, manage any crisis, perform whatever the moment requires without flinching. That constructed self isn't fake in the sense of being incompetent. It's often far more capable than the person underneath it ever was. The cost is that the real self, the one underneath, stops getting used, stops getting fed. Over enough time, it doesn't just go quiet, it starts to disappear, because a self that never gets to act starts to lose the practice of existing at all. The cruelty of the mechanism is that it works precisely because it's so effective. A constructed self that failed at its job would get abandoned quickly. A person would notice the mask wasn't protecting them and go looking for something else. What makes this particular trap so hard to climb back out of is that the performance actually succeeds, repeatedly, in exactly the ways that matter to everyone watching. Ai gets famous. Ruby gets the scandal handled. Aqua gets inside the one organization he needed to infiltrate. Every success reinforces the same lesson. The constructed self is the one that gets results, and the original self, whatever it might have wanted instead, never gets to compete with that track record. It isn't suppressed through force, it's simply outcompeted, quietly, one successful performance at a time, until there's no longer an obvious moment where switching back would even make sense. Watch Ai through exactly that lens, and the whole arc reorganizes itself. She built her performed self as a child, out of necessity, to survive a mother who saw her purely as a means of extraction. That performed self got her through auditions, through fame, through the entire machinery of an industry that would have swallowed her without it. It also meant that by the time she actually had people who loved her, Goru, the twins, some part of her could no longer fully believe the love was landing on her, the real her, rather than on the performance that had gotten so good at generating affection that even she'd started to lose track of where the performance ended. That's the specific tragedy underneath her famous smile, the one the show keeps drawing attention to without ever spelling it out in dialogue. She's asked, more than once, whether the smile is real, and the question never quite gets a clean answer, because by that point in her life, even she may not know anymore. Not because she's lying when she says she loves her children. Every piece of evidence suggests that love is real, possibly the one completely unperformed thing left in her. But the machinery she built to survive her own childhood is so thoroughly integrated into how she moves through the world that separating the performance from the person underneath it has become, for her, a genuinely unanswerable question. That's not a character being coy. That's a false self that succeeded so completely it absorbed its own creator. Ruby inherits that exact structure the moment her own trauma reactivates in Takachiho, which is why the black stars appear on her at all, not because she's becoming powerful, but because she's reaching, instinctively, for the only tool she has any model for handling catastrophic loss with. She watched her mother survive using it. She doesn't know another way, because nobody ever showed her one. There's something particularly bleak in the fact that Ruby doesn't even choose this consciously. Aqua, at least, made a decision, however corrosive, to build his second self on purpose, for a purpose. Ruby's version arrives closer to instinct, a groove already worn into the family by the time it was her turn to fall into it, inherited the way a family trait gets inherited, without her ever agreeing to take it on. That makes her case, in some ways, the saddest of the three. She isn't executing a plan, she's repeating a pattern she never had the chance to recognize before it had already taken over. And Aqua's version of it is the one the show is cruelest about, because his construction isn't reactive the way Ruby's is, it's deliberate, built over years, on purpose, specifically to survive long enough to finish a revenge he's convinced himself is the only reason his second life has any meaning at all. Which is what makes 15-Year Lie the darkest scene in the entire series once you're actually watching for what's happening underneath the production values. Aqua doesn't just cast Ruby to play their mother because she's talented enough for the role. He forces her back into Ai's exact psychological posture, the same wounds, the same defenses, replayed on camera, under his direction, for an audience, not to understand what Ai went through, which is the version of the scene a kinder story might have written. He does it to make Ruby carry the weight of it in front of him, live, repeatedly, take after take, because some part of him needs to see it happen rather than simply be told about it. Watch how he directs those scenes specifically, because the choices are the evidence. He doesn't coach Ruby toward the performance the way a director interested in her craft would, building the character up through technique, giving her room to find her own way into the role. He pushes her directly at the wound, repeatedly, precisely, the way someone with intimate knowledge of exactly where it hurts would push. Each take gets closer to something real, and each time it gets closer, he keeps rolling instead of calling it. A director working from empathy stops the moment the performance stops being a performance and starts being genuine pain. Aqua doesn't stop. He treats the exact point where the acting becomes indistinguishable from real suffering as the point where the scene finally becomes usable. That's not directing. That's a boy who's lost enough access to his own capacity for empathy that inflicting his sister's trauma on her, on camera, reads to him as the efficient way to get the performance he needs, the exact logic the Black Stars have been running the entire time, now pointed at the one person in his life who never should have been treated as raw material. That's the moment the thesis stops being a pattern you can argue about and becomes something closer to a diagnosis you can't unsee. The Black Stars were never marking who was strong enough to survive this industry. They were marking who had already started disappearing in order to survive it. And the show has been quietly keeping score the entire time, in the one place none of these characters ever thought to look for the cost. There's a reason none of them notice the cost while it's happening, and it isn't stupidity. It's the specific design of the trap. A self that's disappearing doesn't announce its own disappearance because the part of a person that would normally raise the alarm is the same part being replaced. I can't fully sound the warning about her own hollowness because the machinery generating the warning and the machinery performing the smile run through the same increasingly blurred system. Aqua can't clock what he's becoming through 15-year lie because the version of him capable of that kind of self-recognition is exactly the version the Black Star has been quietly starving for years. The disappearance is invisible from the inside by construction, not by accident, which is precisely why it takes an audience watching from outside the performance to see the eyes change color and understand what the show has been telling them all along. Which is why the cheering in the comment sections misses the point of the scene by exactly the width of the thing it's celebrating. Every time those eyes go dark, something real in that character just went quiet to make room for something that can survive better than they can. The Black Stars were never the moment a character got stronger. They were the moment there was a little less of an actual person left standing behind the performance doing all that surviving for them.